It's the World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey has graced us with his presence.
Well, it's nice to be back in Paris.
Nice to see you. Welcome back as well to Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time magazine.
Good to be here.
Good to have you. Silvia Ayuso, Paris correspondent for Spanish broadsheet of record, El País.
Good to be here, too.
Nice to see you. Paul Taylor, contributing editor for Politico, who's about to leave town. We'll talk perhaps more about that in a moment.
Indeed.
The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag World This Week. The whole world is marching. Fridays for the Future rallies follow a week when French scientists warned that without a radical cut in greenhouse gases, the planet will heat up by an average of 7 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Greta Thunberg's in New York, the 16-year-old effigy of the movement she spawned with her sit-ins last summer outside Sweden's parliament. She'll be front and center at a climate conference at the UN, timed to coincide with the arrival of world leaders for the annual opening of the General Assembly. Paul Taylor, you're going to be off to New York, where it's all happening.
Tomorrow morning, and although I won't be actually at the climate summit itself, I'm going to a side event where Europeans and Chinese are sitting down to talk about whether they can agree on a minimum price for carbon and make their minimum prices converge over time. Because I think many people think that the only way to actually fight climate change is to gradually make emitting carbon more expensive and send long-term economic signals to business so that it's worth their while. They have a regulatory framework and everything to go green.
And we've noticed this Friday, because there have been big Fridays for Future weeks that happened in the spring a couple of times. The difference being, our Berlin correspondent, there were 100,000 people at the Brandenburg Gate this Friday, saying in amongst the crowd, it wasn't just young people anymore. There were people, there were business people, there were people from the private sector more and more.
Absolutely. I mean, Germany is going, the whole of German society, I think, is going green. And so the government has finally had to sort of try and get ahead of that movement. Otherwise, their lunch is going to be eaten by a party called the Greens, who are neck and neck with Angela Merkel's Christian Democrats in the polls. So either Germany, as it were, goes green under a coalition of Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, or else the future is politically green. I think that's the equation. But Germany obviously is the home of a huge auto industry, the biggest in Europe. And so what Germany does matters. I think they get it about the carbon price. Some of the German companies actually, Metro, for example, the big global sort of wholesale supermarket, are doing amazing things in terms of reducing. They've set an internal carbon price within the company to force themselves to reduce their emissions.
Now, we talk about the auto industry. It was the week where the U.S. president effectively bigfooted California's deal with automakers to reduce their emission standards. How much will this be an issue on the campaign trail in 2020?
It's hard to say. For one thing, when it comes to California, Trump knows that he's not going to win California in the next elections. He's going to lose all those electoral votes he did last time, and the Republicans almost always do. This was just a nail in that coffin. But in fact, Trump is going to continue to play to his base, play to the people who support him financially, meaning big coal, big industry like that. He was just on TV with the Australian Prime Minister today talking about how those Australians really know how to make clean coal or something. It's never clear with Trump exactly what he's saying. But, you know, in terms of the emergency that we're looking at, I just looked at a profile I originally wrote of Jacques Cousteau, the great undersea explorer, 30 years ago. And at the time, he was warning that if the world didn't turn itself around in 10 years, all would be lost. He didn't mean that it would be lost 10 years from then, but basically we would enter into an irreversible cycle. And in fact, we have entered into an irreversible cycle. People don't want to admit it, but we're going to have to evacuate coastal areas. We're building around Manhattan, where I just was, a multi-billion-dollar wall to try and pretend that you can have a dike against the Atlantic Ocean directly in New York City. That's the kind of thing we're going to see more and more of, and that's what Greta Thunberg is talking about all the time. Whether anybody will listen even now to Greta Thunberg any more than they did to Jacques Cousteau, I'm not sure. I think not.
Well, and of course, I totally agree. Then you see also one thing is the big promises, the political promises. On the other hand, you see, we were in France. We've seen last year with the yellow vests how difficult sometimes it is. Also, everybody feels ecological until the moment it hits your pocket. And the yellow vest protest started with the taxes on oil and fuel. So it's even though Macron has turned definitely, or so he says, President Macron, ecological, because it's the turn in politics, but it's very difficult to combine, and I think that's a big divide they have.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit more in depth in a minute, but I just want to point out one irony about the UN week that's coming up. While the planet tries to cut its carbon habit, the other issue that will dominate UN week is how to keep the Gulf region safe for oil transport. That's because of those attacks on two main terminals of the Saudi oil company affecting 6% of the world's oil output and sending crude prices on their biggest single-day spike since Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Yemen's Houthi militias claiming responsibility, but Washington blames its Iranian backers. The U.S. president dispatching his Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who called the attacks an act of war. His Iranian counterpart warning of all-out war in case of reprisals. By Thursday, the tone had softened, though.
While the foreign minister of Iran is threatening all-out war and to fight to the last American, we're here to build out a coalition aimed at achieving peace and a peaceful resolution of this. That's my mission set. It's what President Trump certainly wants me to work to achieve.
Gosh, it's been such a roller coaster week when it comes to those attacks. Vivian Walt, your reaction first at the beginning of the week.
This is incredible because, it is kind of amazing how big the Saudi oil infrastructure is. It's just vast, and I have been there in those oil fields, and it's just, I was in one oil field where there are 300 wells just in that one oil field. That was one of them that was hit this week. I think that what's surprising is actually that there wasn't more of a fallout. The fallout might come later. It might come in terms of people starting to reassess the security of the entire world's oil supplies, the routes, how one secures oil fields at all. And of course, the other fallout is the Yemen war, which is let's not forget, this is really what it's about. It's about the competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the region, which is being played out in Yemen, next door Saudi Arabia. So I think that although the disruption to the oil supplies is going to be very temporary, what we're likely to see is that the Yemen war is finally sort of become global.
So the Trump administration dialing back the bellicose rhetoric slightly. We heard Mike Pompeo go back on what he'd said earlier in the week. But then this Friday, Trump making good on that promise of stepped-up sanctions.
Stepped-up sanctions. Look, we've talked about this before on the show. Trump's big weapon is the dollar. He thinks that money can deal with all of this. And today he basically cut off all money to Iran. And he thinks that Iran will bend, and maybe they will. But Iran also calculated, let's just be straight, Iran was behind this. There's no question about that. But you'll notice that Trump was not calling it an act of war. Pompeo, who's a terrible hawk, was calling it an act of war. And the Saudis are not saying that Iran did it. They're saying that was behind it. Those are not just little nuances in the Middle East. What Iran did when they calculated this hit was to leave the door open for a certain level of deniability that would allow Trump, would allow the Saudis not to immediately go to war because this was a 9/11, if you will. And for instance, and tellingly, nobody was killed. Now, this looked like Armageddon, right? The video was incredible.
Oilmageddon.
And 6%.
Oilmageddon.
Oilmageddon. And 6% of the world's oil supply was knocked offline. But nobody was killed. Because blood is something that you fight over. But maybe oil is not something that particularly Donald Trump is ready to fight over.
And again, the oil, if it had been in 1991 that this had happened, would people have fought over it? Today, the U.S. has its own shale and oil, perhaps.
Yeah, the U.S. is no longer dependent on Gulf oil. It is, however, dependent in a broader sense on stability of some sort in the Gulf. And some of its allies and clients are dependent on Gulf oil, the Japanese, to some extent the Europeans. And of course, the other thing is that the U.S. has a military presence in the Gulf and regards itself still as the policeman of the Gulf, even if that's not Donald Trump's favorite activity. And I think they'd much rather be doing this themselves than see the Chinese, who are big consumers of Arab oil, doing it in their place. So the question is, can they still kind of find a way of being the power that maintains a balance and an order of some sort in the Gulf? President Trump, in a way, created this crisis originally by tearing up the agreement with Iran on Iran's nuclear program, which he did because any agreement signed by his predecessor was necessarily a bad deal and the worst deal that America had ever signed, and so on. But actually now he's seeing that there's a high price to be paid for having torn up that deal, and it's not clear whether he will take military action or whether he will, in the Iranian eyes, I suppose, blink and say, all right.
Well, the sanctions are not a blink.
Sylvia Yusso, what are your expectations going as all these world leaders get set to gather in New York next week?
Not big. I mean, I don't think that the UN has ever made. I mean, the Assembly has. It gets deals. I mean, let's remember it was, if I'm not mistaken, the first time they met Obama and the Iranian in a casual way. I mean, it offers a possibility of doing some diplomacy that it's not officially diplomacy, so it gives some space. But I don't know if there's time enough for a big agreement on anything, at least at this stage.
All right. Well, after winning plaudits for his middleman role when he hosted the G7 summit at the end of last month, the man who Time magazine put on its cover with the title, The Next Leader of Europe, spoke again to Vivian Walt, here present this week. Will the UN be Macron's moment for what Sylvia is hoping for, perhaps some kind of a breaking of the ice?
Well, I can't tell you, as apropos Iran, for example, which is one thing that I did get to speak to him about. I think that he regarded Iran as the one little window that he had to influence Trump, and that he actually did see some chance that he could get Rouhani and Trump together, the Iranian president. I spoke to him a few days before the attack on the oil fields, and I would think that that is now basically not going to happen. But he himself said he's very cautious because they're hardliners on both sides, and those hardliners are working actively to scuttle whatever mediation he has. And by the way, that man on the right is his point person on Iran. This was a senior staff meeting. We spent the day inside the Elysee. The day began with a senior staff meeting, which we were allowed in briefly just to get some photographs. And next to him on his left is Emmanuel Bon, who is his point guy on Iran.
And Magnum photojournalist Christopher Anderson with these pictures. What was his? He must be in a better place than he was, right, after the yellow vests and his popularity sinking to.
And no doubt that's why he agreed to see us. But when we first began discussing the interview, which was a couple of months ago, he had wanted to do it before the G7. The timing just didn't work out for Time magazine, so we kind of dropped the idea and we decided to reschedule it for the rentrée and to focus it very much on what he's going to do now that he's had this ghastly year.
All right, and Sylvia was mentioning it earlier, and you asked him, Vivian, about how the Yellow Vest movement has perhaps changed the way he governs and thinks.
I think this is the French system. In our country, we like leadership, and we want to kill the leaders.
We
Great
like
quote.
leadership and we want to kill the leaders. Christopher Dickey.
It's a great quote, isn't it? I think he's exactly
full of
right.
them.
He seems to know the French very well.
In this particular case, because we have an Angela Merkel, a bit of a lame duck, kind of positioning himself as leader of Europe. What's his standing now? Because, again, it's a mixed bag, right? Domestically, but what about on the world stage?
Well, I think in terms of dealing with Europe, I mean, it's like herding cats. I think it's very hard to get Europe behind anything. Angela Merkel had the advantage that she's Germany, that it's by far the most powerful economy in Europe, and they were financing much of Europe. France plays its role, but nothing like Germany. So I don't think that we'll see. I don't know if Angela Merkel's successor is going to have that potential. Macron's doing what the French always want to do. He wants to be the driving diplomatic force, a person who understands everything better than anybody else, the leader, even if they want to kill their leader. I'm not sure he can do it, but it may be easier after Brexit.
What do the Spanish think of that?
Well, the Spanish are quite busy right now with other problems on their
But what
own.
do they think when Macron takes the microphone and says, "Look, I'm here"?
Well, I mean, Spain has played like an aid. I mean, Spain they've played a good alliance this past year on several issues like immigration policies. So Spain has been playing along with France. I wouldn't say that they recognize him as a leader, but Macron tried it from the beginning, this duo with Berlin. This was his first trip, was to Berlin, but it hasn't played out well because Angela Merkel is it's weakened, so he's trying to go solo, and I'm not sure that this plays out. I mean, but from the Spanish side, they do agree in many politics, I think.
French leaders are never team players. They want to be out there. They grand gestures and la France à l'avant, France in front. But they're not necessarily very good at working alliances and so on. But I think Macron's got a very good moment here, where he's here till 2022 rather. He could well be there for another 5 years afterwards. So he is the strongest European leader at the moment with the longest life expectancy in power if he plays his cards right.
All right, we'll talk about short or long life expectancies after what's been a tumultuous week in Silvia Yuso's Spain, but also in Israel. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week.
I'm Gulliver Cragg, France 24's correspondent in Kiev. I'm forever crisscrossing Ukraine, Poland and other countries in the region to keep you up to date with all the news from Central and Eastern Europe. Join me on Live from Paris and in all France 24's news and magazine programmes.
Gulliver Cragg, one of the 200 France 24 correspondents around the world.
On July 23, 2018, the Atapo Dam in Laos collapsed.
That dam up there was a curse. There's death, poverty, hunger all around us.
My rice paddy, my money, everything was taken away.
No one is allowed to talk about the tragedy. The government continues its relentless sale of Laos' natural resources.
No one dares to speak.
There'll be nothing to grow and nothing left to fish in the rivers for the next generations. Instead, there'll be only foreign investors.
Watch our investigation into a tragedy foretold.
Reporters, presented by Mark Owen on France 24 and France24.com. The world is ever-changing. The news doesn't wait. That's why at France 24, we'll always be there to help make sense of world events. For the best international coverage, 24 hours a day, no matter what. France 24, with you everywhere, all the time. Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Welcome back. Before we resume The World This Week, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. Fridays for the Future rallies around the planet over 5 continents. Big crowds gathering in New York, where world leaders will converge next week at the UN. Marches in Germany coincide with the unveiling of the government's long-anticipated plan to meet its carbon-cutting targets. They include taxing gas-guzzling cars and incentives to take the train instead of the plane for shorter trips. Twitter shuts more than 4,000 fake accounts for spreading hate or propaganda, many of them in China targeting Hong Kong, as well as pro-Saudi accounts in Egypt and the UAE. Japan kicks off its very first World Cup in rugby as Prince Akishino officially declares the tournament open, the hosts starting their campaign on the right foot with a 30-10 win over Russia. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. The Daily Beast foreign editor, Chris Verdicki, is with us. Welcome back as well to Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time magazine. From Spanish daily newspaper El País, Silvia Ayuso, Paris correspondent. Welcome back to you. And Paul Taylor, contributing editor at Politico. Israel voted Tuesday, its second snap general election in just under 6 months. And as usual, now comes the interesting bit. It's once again about the horse trading for forming a coalition, the political battle of Benjamin Netanyahu's life, what with corruption cases pending against the Likud leader. But although he fell short this time, with the Conservatives earning 2 fewer seats than the centrist Blue and White Party, neither has a clear path to majority. Netanyahu has since offered to lead a government of national unity. The response was swift.
I'm interested in, and I intend to form, a broad and liberal unity government headed by myself, a government that will express the people's will and our promises to the public. We will listen carefully to everyone, but we will not surrender to decrees.
Now, they've got till November to form this government, but already there's talk of a third general election on the trot, and that would be unprecedented for Israel.
Well, I mean, it's difficult to count Bibi out, but I think he's done. I think it's clear he did not win this election, certainly not enough for any kind of a mandate. And putting together a coalition is going to be very, very difficult for him. He relies quite a lot on, far right-wing religious blocs, right-wing secular blocs. They can't agree on things, and I think the preference seems to be emerging quite clearly for him to be out.
Bibi is done, Chris Verdicki?
Well, as Vivian says, you can't count him out. And my feeling when I look at all this kaleidoscopic movement of parties in Israel is wake me when it's over. So, I really can't follow, as hard as I try, the day-to-day, hour-to-hour manipulation of the system. But I wouldn't be surprised if, when you wake me up, you told me that somehow Bibi had cobbled it together again. On the other hand, if Benny Gantz can continue to push the idea of a government of national unity that includes the Likud but doesn't include Bibi, then that's a real possibility. And the thing we have to remember is that Bibi is facing multiple indictments for corruption. And part of the reason he couldn't form a government the last time around was he was trying to form a government that would pass a law that would make him immune to those prosecutions. Nobody's going to give that to him this time. So we'll see.
So to break this deadlock, is this it? Is it time for his political obituary?
It's a little early premature for his political obituary, but I would say, what we're seeing is the beginning of the end. And the end may take quite a few months, and it may take another election, or it may be done without. There's certainly people in his own party who will remain loyal to him as long as they think he can kill them, but who would be quite happy to enter a unity government without him, I think, eventually. And so the question is, partly, can the president nudge things in that direction? President Rivlin, I don't think, is one of the greatest admirers of Netanyahu. Can the Israeli justice system nudge things in that direction by stepping up the corruption proceedings against him? There'll be an opportunity in October. And can the Israeli society begin to put more pressure on their politicians to get things together. The risk, of course, is he's got a big best friend in the White House. And he's got still quite a lot of cards that he can play. And if the situation were to get very unstable with Iran or whatever, then there's always the risk that he reemerges saying, I'm the rock, the only person who can handle this with Iran and with Trump.
But I think you did see Trump even this week just like slightly backing off and kind of waiting to see who's actually going to be the winner. He doesn't want to get too close with any loser, as we know, and not in Israel either.
And we haven't even mentioned Avigdor Lieberman.
Right.
Who may hold the balance. The Russian, as it were, the Russian political leader in
Soviet,
in Israel.
Since he was Moldovan. But the
Soviet, if you will.
Yeah, but if you think it's a bit chaotic in Israel with a possibility of a third election in 2 years, Sylvia Ayuso will tell you that's nothing. Spain's going to the polls for the fourth time in 4 years, and that's a certainty. More political parties making it harder to form stable coalitions these days. And when socialist Pedro Sanchez didn't like what he saw to his left and to his right, he pressed on the trigger for a poll scheduled now for November the 10th.
You've wanted elections from the beginning, but you have been playing with the Spaniards for the last 5 months.
Spain needs stability, moderation, and a progressive government. That's what Spain needs, Mr. Casado, not the blockade.
Possibility of a deal here between the centrists on the one side or the hard left Podemos party?
It's become a pain more than Spain. It's the problem is everybody played to the extremes. I mean, in Spain right now there's a huge disappointment. There's a lot of mistrust, and it's a failure not of the system, not of the democracy. It's a failure of the politicians. I think everybody agrees, despite your ideologies, all the heads of the parties have failed the Spaniards, and a lot of Spaniards feel like, what's my vote worth if you're unable? Because nobody has been able or nobody has wanted, even tried to negotiate. I mean, Pedro Sanchez never had enough votes to govern by himself, the Socialist Party, so he needed either the left, who put a lot of conditions eventually, but they played this chicken game and this mistrust. They've poisoned so much the aim. That you ask yourself, if we're going again to elections, can there ever be a coalition on that side? But on the right side, or the center-right side, Ciudadanos, who was the natural ally until a year ago, they said from the beginning, just before, we're not going to negotiate with the Socialist Party. So that was closed before the election. So in the best case scenario, we go to elections and we have more or less the same results. But with the difference that now everybody mistrusts everybody.
Yeah, could Sanchez, because Sanchez had been going up in the polls through all this crisis, has he overplayed his hand though? Will Spaniards want to vote for him again?
Best case scenario for him, he gets a little bit more votes, but it's probably not enough to govern by himself, and he's killed his chances on the left. The chances on the right don't look any good now either. And the thing is always from the left point side. I mean, always in Spain, they say it's not the right. I think I've said that before. It's not the right that wins the elections. It's the left that loses it, because it's usually the left that abstains from elections when they're disappointed. And I can say, as a citizen, a lot of my friends in Spain, they're all saying, we're staying home, we're not doing this again. And this is a very dangerous game for everybody.
This fragmentation of the political landscape, we've seen it happen over time in Spain.
It's happening all over Europe,
but
the difference,
I
think the difference is that in Spain there seems to be a particular reluctance of the political class to make pragmatic coalitions. Whether this is some sort of Spanish rigidity, obviously the issue of Catalan separatism poisons the situation as well, because it's the reason why the centrists, who really ought to be natural coalition partners for Sanchez, won't get into bed with him, because they want him to take a tougher line against Catalan separatism. They suspect him of wanting to make a deal with the Catalans. And but elsewhere in Europe, look at Portugal. Portugal could teach Spain a lesson. You have a very popular minority socialist government that is backed by two further left parties, is able to carry out policies which have been successful, which have been fiscally responsible, but allowed people more growth and more money.
Or dare we say Italy, where there was a falling out and they managed to form another coalition?
They did manage to form another coalition, although how long-lasting that will be, I think, remains to be seen. But certainly Italy pulled back from the brink of a pretty radical Eurosceptical government, and now has a government that the whole of Europe wants to help.
I also think, even if Spain has already 40 years of democracy, this is the first time in the past 4 years that it's passed. It's been always, until 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years, a bipartisan. It was the Socialist Party and the Popular Party. Sometimes they needed some help, but this is really the first time where the right and the left are split in different parties. So this has changed, and I think the politicians haven't learned yet, which is a very bad thing, to deal with that they have to, that there is no way probably in the future to get a absolute majority.
Yeah, it's a similar story in Germany, here in France.
In Germany, they learned it
and in the UK, two big blocs that have come apart. In the UK, it's been quite spectacular, where it's unfolding these days in real time with that October 31st Brexit deadline looming. So, for instance, when the Supreme Court heard arguments this week for overturning Boris Johnson's longer than usual suspension of Parliament, it heard arguments from another Conservative, his predecessor, former Prime Minister John Major. The polarization is glaring, like when Johnson visited a teaching hospital in London this week.
There are not enough people on this ward. There are not enough doctors. There are not enough nurses. Right. The NHS has been destroyed. It's been destroyed. It's been destroyed. And now you come here for a press opportunity.
Well, actually, there's no press here.
What do you mean there's no press here? Who are these people?
Sir, will you just stop raising your voices?
We're here to actually here to find out what we can do further to this.
Well, that's not going to fix things now. It's a bit late, isn't it?
And this is what the campaign is, because it's going to be a campaign, right? This is what the campaign's going to be like?
I think that what is so disturbing here, in terms of Europe and Brexit, is that there seems to be a complete disconnect in perceptions between what Britain feels it can leverage over the EU and the EU feeling like it's really done. They've moved on. They've got a whole raft of new commissioners that does not include Britain. And I spoke to somebody in Brussels this week that said, we don't even think about the Brits anymore. They're just out of our mind. It's just like last year's thing. And, they're sitting down to business.
They'll be thinking about them next month when there's that EU summit in Brussels to decide what to do.
What they're going to do is say, adieu. They're going to say, good luck, Britain. But it's not fair to say that Britain is the problem. The problem is the Tories. The problem is Boris Johnson. The problem is a system, talk about a screwed up parliamentary system. The problem is a system where 90,000 decrepit Tories can name a man who's going to drag the country out of the European Union. That's the problem. And it isn't that Britain doesn't want to be in Europe. We don't know that anymore. That was a crazy referendum 3 years ago. It was a referendum based on lies.
And what's so painful now is to see David Cameron on his book tour as kind of, he's fine, you know.
As President Chirac would have said, he's missing a good opportunity to shut up, I think. But no, I actually don't agree with you guys. So
then be quiet. You're missing a great opportunity to shut up.
Let me make the contrarian argument. No, I mean, I agree with you entirely that the lunatics have taken over the asylum in British politics on both sides, that we now have radical forces that show that there are real structural weaknesses in Britain politically, constitutionally, and so on. That said, I think Boris Johnson actually needs a deal, and I think that there are stirrings of a deal around, and I would not be at all surprised to see a last-minute deal in Brussels on or around the very late on the 18th.
You're a former Brussels
October.
correspondent.
Yeah.
Can you do a so-called Brussels fudge on this one?
I don't think you can do a Brussels fudge, but I think that you can put, as the British say, lipstick on the pig. You know, essentially dress up Mrs. May's deal, which never got through the House of Commons, and say that you've made it totally different and you've negotiated a far better deal. A bit like
And Westminster
President
would go along
Trump
with it?
did on NAFTA, if you remember.
And Westminster will go along with it?
I think there are a lot of desperate people in Westminster who don't want to take responsibility for a no-deal Brexit, and who, when a gun is put to their head in the last week of October, will vote to ratify an agreement rather than just go over the cliff. And what Boris Johnson has done, and he's done all sorts of bad things, but the one thing he's done is by really trying to make this as much as he can a hard deadline, he's focused people's minds. The risk, however, that we go over the cliff is still there, but I don't think that he's deliberately leading the UK over the cliff. And maybe there is still room. And, you know, if
Without
you listen
getting
a
into
little
the
bit to
technicalities, what do you think, Paul? Do you think moving the border into the Irish Sea is the way to go? Moving the
I think that there'll be some sort of way maybe found to declare Northern Ireland a special economic zone with a special relationship with the South and with the EU, which effectively is a different way of moving the border into the Irish Sea,
Exactly.
at least as a fallback after perhaps a longer transition period.
Finally, should he have known better? Back when Justin Trudeau was a teacher, before he entered politics in 2001, Canada's Liberal Prime Minister wore brown face with his Aladdin costume to an Arabian Nights party. His apology for that and the other pictures and videos that have since surfaced coming in the throes of a general election campaign, where Trudeau seemed to be pulling ahead of the opposition Conservatives until this all was published.
Earlier today, you were questioned about how many times you have appeared in blackface or brownface. I'll make it easy. Is it possible to round to the nearest 5?
I'm not going to make light of the situation. I don't think it's something that we should be making light of. What I did was inexcusable and wrong and hurt a lot of people who considered me to be an ally. And that is wrong. And I am deeply, deeply sorry.
So, Vivian Walt, that question, should he have known better? Is he...
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, this was not the 1950s we're talking about. This was 2000, even if it was the 1950s. And the fact that, they've so far discovered 3 incidents, and he himself doesn't quite know how many others are out there. I think the other intriguing question is, why is it that this has not come to light in nearly 20 years? And what exactly went on to make sure that it did not come to light? So I think that this is very serious for him.
I want to know what possessed him to do this. Let's put aside the question of the morals of it. What possessed him to do it? I mean, okay, once as Aladdin, maybe once as Harry Belafonte, but so many times that he can't even be sure how many times. I'm waiting for that explanation. Why did you do it? And I don't think it's because he's a racist. I don't think so at all.
Right. I mean, I would simply say, should this be the issue that determines the outcome of the Canadian general election? Has this Prime Minister in the last few years made his country a more open, more inclusive, more liberal
Because that's what he's running on. Those are
that's what he's done.
Yeah. Exactly. And if we discover that certainly, as he says himself, misguided prank, or he liked to dress up in brown face 15 or 20 years ago, should that be what determines what kind of government Canada has for the next 4 years?
Silvia Ayuso?
I agree with you. It's maybe it's the European and South Mediterranean. I mean, we joke a lot and we have very incorrect humor. I mean, 20 years ago, I made jokes I wouldn't do today, probably. And a lot of people, I mean, it doesn't excuse him, but he wasn't in a power position. He wasn't, at least at the time, I think, not thinking about becoming a politician. It's unfortunate, but I wouldn't judge him for what he did 20 years ago, given what he's done in the past a few years, and as a politician. So, and he's apologized a lot. I mean, what else can he do right now?
He was someone, though, in the public eye. His father had been prime minister before.
I was going to say, he's not just another guy. I mean, his father had been prime minister. But I think the contrition will work in his favor. We're a month away from the election. The news cycle turns over very quickly. Get it all out there. Obviously his strategy is get it all out there, get it out now. And a month from now, people will remember what he's done as prime minister, and they won't be thinking about what he did as a young professor.
I mean, he was already in trouble, let's not forget. And
I know, but have you seen the speeches of his opponent? I mean, please.
Yes. Well, I was going to say, the great sort of determining factor here is who he's up against. And it's not like somebody has come to oppose him who's just phenomenally good and impressive and
or liberal.
Everyone array.
Yeah.
So, yes.
So if climate change is more important than brownface, probably people should vote Trudeau, right?
Yes.
If acceptance of Syrian refugees is more important than brownface, they should vote for Trudeau. If integrating Asians and people of African descent into the society is more important than brownface or blackface, they should vote Trudeau. All of those things. So maybe some, as we call them, youthful indiscretions will cost him the Prime Minister's job, in which case I say good luck to Canada.
And on that happy note...
Always with me a happy note.
We'll leave it there. Christopher Dickey, I want to thank you, Sylvia Ayuso, Paul Taylor, Vivian Walt. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.